under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. Question 1. What is the mood of the townspeople as they gather for the lottery? They're mostly lighthearted and friendly. They are all serious and sad, and nervous and scared, or they are completely quiet.
A.
A. They are mostly lighthearted and friendly. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business. And people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying a black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him carrying a three-legged stool. The stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter, came forward to hold the box steadily on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box, now resting on the stool, had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now, it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Question 2. How do the townspeople view the lottery box? A, they are afraid of it. B, they want to get rid of it. C, they see it as a part of tradition. Or D, they are disinterested in the box.
They see it as a part of tradition.
Good. They see it as a part of their tradition. C. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now the population was more than 300 and likely to keep growing. It was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box. And it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square the next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn and another year underfoot in the post office. And sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households of each family, members of each household of each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believe that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people. But years and years ago, this part of this ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box, but this also had changed with time. Until now, it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this, in his clean white shirt and blue jeans with one hand resting carelessly on the black box. He seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Question 3. The rituals of the lottery, A, have become more casual over time. B, are the same as they have been for generations. C, have become stricter and more serious over time. Or have been entirely forgotten by the town.
They're more casual.
Good. A, they have become more casual. So the whole village is gathered in the square for this ritual of the lottery. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders and slid into place in the back of the crowd. Clean forgot what day it was, she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. Thought my old man was out back stacking wood, Mrs. Hutchinson went on. And then I looked out the window and the kid was gone. And then I remembered it was the 27th and came running. She dried her hands on her apron and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson," and, "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson grinning. "Wouldn't have me leave them dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. Number 4, how does the town respond to Mrs. Hutchinson's lateness? Suspiciously, rudely, angrily, or pleasantly?
Pleasantly.
Good. They're like, oh well. But they did notice that she was gone. 1 person out of 300, and they noticed. "Well, now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with so we can get back to work. Anybody ain't here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar. Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right. He's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. "Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year." Question 5. Why is Mrs. Dunbar participating in the lottery? It's her turn. None of the men in her family are able to. She's being punished by the town, or no one in her family will volunteer.
None of the men in her family are able to.
Good. So now we know that it's typically men that draw, but this year a woman will be filling in for her husband and son. "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, Watson boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. Here, he said, I'm drawing from a mother and me. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it? Here, a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. All ready? He called. Now I'll read the names. Heads of the families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear? The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, Adams. A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, Hi, Joe. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. Allen, Mr. Summers said, Anderson, Betham. Seems like there's no time in between all lotteries anymore. No time at all between lotteries anymore, Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. Seems like we got through the last one only last week. Time sure goes fast, Mrs. Graves said. Clark, Delacroix? There goes my old man, Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. Question 6. After the lottery begins, the townspeople become excited, nervous, energetic, relaxed. Owen?
B.
More nervous. So at first, they were in good humor. Now that it's started, they're all kind of looking at each other nervously. Dunbar, Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, Go on, Janie, and another said, There she goes. We're next, Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her 2 sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Harbor, Hutchinson, get up there, Bill, Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. Jones, they do say, Mr. Adams said to old man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village, they're talking of giving up the lottery. Old man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said. Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Lived that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery, he said, petulantly. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, old man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Why does the town have a lottery? A, it is tradition that is thought to bring the good harvest. B, both the young and old support the lottery. C, they like to remember their town's history. Or D, they genuinely enjoy it.
A.
Good. It is a tradition that is thought to bring them good harvest. Martin and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy, I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They're almost through, her son said. You get ready to run tell Dad, Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward. Precisely, and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner, 77th year I've been in the lottery," old man Warner said, and as he went through the crowd, 77th time. "Watson," the tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, "Don't be nervous, Jack." And Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son." "Zanini?" After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." After a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Why is Mrs. Hutchinson upset? A, Mr. Summers tricked her husband. B, she wasn't chosen for the lottery. C, her husband was chosen for the lottery. Or D, Mr. Summers chose her husband for the lottery."
Her husband was chosen for the lottery.
What?
He was chosen.
Yeah, her husband was chosen for the lottery. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted the next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Dawn and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids." "Then as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers said formally. "3, Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill, Junior, and Nancy, and little Dave, and Tessie and me." "All right then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we ought to start over," Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. "I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw it." Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box. And he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. Question 9. Mrs. Hutchinson tries to convince the town people that the lottery should be stopped. Her husband wasn't given a fair chance. Her husband shouldn't be participating, or her husband took the wrong piece of paper.
Wasn't given a fair chance.
Good. She says he didn't have enough time. Everyone saw it. "Listen, everybody," Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12 and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. Bill Jr., Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet over large, nearly knocked the box over as he took the paper out. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched the paper out and held it behind her. Bill, Mr. Summers said. Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open Little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time. And both beamed and laughed, turning around with the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. Question 10. Why are the children happy? They have won the lottery, their family has been chosen for the lottery, this is the town's final lottery, or they have not been chosen for the lottery.
They have not been chosen for the lottery.
Good. So we know that this lottery is something negative, that people do not want to be chosen for. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us your paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said, "let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground, the glowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead, and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her in the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers and Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed when they were upon her. What happens to Mrs. Hutchinson at the end of the story? A, she is killed by the townspeople with stones. B, she is tricked into picking the paper with the black mark. C, she is banished from the town and never able to return. Or D, she is punished by the townspeople for a crime she committed.
Killed by stones.
A, she is killed by the townspeople with stones. Even her children and husband are going to throw stones. They're not even like freaking out. It's just a normal thing. Okay, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to answer the assessment questions and discussion question. Make sure you cite examples from the text. For the discussion question, it should at least be like 3 to 5 sentences. And then we will watch the short film. So once I have both of yours submitted, we'll move on.
Turn on the TV. feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed so easily. My anxiety keeps me silent. When I try to speak, what's come over me feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed. Jesus, I don't know my space. The cards are shut down, I'm all assimilated. Nobody gets it. Say I'm too sensitive. I can't listen cause I'm really absent. It's mine, isn't mine. Who am I to judge? I should be fine, but it's all too much. I get overwhelmed so easily. My anxiety creeps inside of me, makes it hard to breathe. What's come over me feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed so easily. My anxiety keeps me silent. When I try to speak, what's come over me feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed. I should be fine, but it's all so much. I should be fine, but I'm not. I get overwhelmed so easily. My anxiety creeps inside of me, makes it hard to breathe. What's come over me feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed so easily. Creeps inside of me, feels like I'm somebody else. Overwhelmed.
slated short film. This is, like I said, I think 18 minutes long. I am not going to have you do number 3, so you can mark that out. But make sure you see that number 1 at the top is those boxes. We'll do number 2. You don't need to do 3, and then the rest.
Okay.
And we'll talk about this after.
Steve hates doing those TV dinners. I don't blame him.
Dick Delcar's a pet. I think he's cute. I understand that I'm just a second grade teacher.
You know, Rosa, finished yesterday.
Come on, Helen, put him back.
You ever hear of taxes going down?
Then I'm gonna finish it off with some lace around the sleeves.
Harry, you come here now. Sally,
Come here.
Bobby Hunt.
You, Bob, come here, now.
Little late today, folks. Guess this'll do it, Harry. Some of you fellas want to give me a hand? Come on, Vic. Thank you, Bill. Hi, Baxter. Think that should do it?
Oh, I even forgot what day it was. I looked out the window and the kids was gone. I remember it was the 27th. I came running. You're in time. Still getting ready.
Do you solemnly swear that you will perform without prejudice or favoritism those duties prescribed by custom and dictated by law?
I do.
Those up front.
Postmaster
See you later.
of the community by the authority of my office, I appoint you master of the lottery.
Here comes Tessie, Bill. Thought we were gonna have to get on without you, Tessie.
You wouldn't have any dishes in the sink, would you, Joe?
Well, now, guess we better get started. Get this over with so as we can go back to work. Anybody else ain't here?
Dunbar.
Clyde Dunbar ain't here.
Clyde Dunbar. That's right, he's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him this year?
I guess.
Janie, ain't you got a grown boy to do it for you?
Well, Horace ain't 16 yet. I guess I'll have to do it myself this year.
Watson boy drawing this year?
Here.
I'm drawing for me and my mom.
Good boy, Jack. Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it.
Well, I guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it? Here. All ready? I'll read the names then. Heads of families first. The men come up and draw a paper out of the box. I keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone's had a turn. Everything clear? Adam. Hi, Joe. Nice to see you. Anderson. Bentham.
Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore. Seems like only last week we got through with the last one.
Time sure does go fast.
Clark. Morning, Andy.
Morning, Joe.
Delacroix.
Hi, Stan.
Hi, Joe.
Dunbar.
There she goes.
Where next?
Graves. Harvard. Hutchinson.
Get up there, Bill.
That a girl, Tessie?
Jones.
They say over in Warren County, they're talking about giving up the lottery.
Pack of crazy fools, listening to the young folks. Nothing is good enough for them.
Judd.
First thing you know, everybody want to be going back and living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while.
Klepper.
Used to be a saying, lottery in June, corn heavy soon. Next thing we'd know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns.
Langley.
There's always been a lottery.
Hi, Mitch. Hi, Joe.
Bad enough to see young Joe Summers out there joking with everybody.
Mark.
Some places have already quit lotteries.
Nothing but trouble in that. Pack of young fools.
Overdyke.
I wish they'd hurry.
Percy.
Robinson.